Well, thanks, Brian, for inviting me, and Joel and everybody in the club. We're not talking about kindness today, but in a way we are. We're going to talk about grief. So grief can come from many sources, as you all know. I mean, you might lose a job, or your home, or your marriage, but today we're going to focus on grieving the death of someone that we loved. So what I'll talk about is a few facts about grief, my own experience losing my first wife, my experience of writing poetry to express my own grief and the origins of the book that Brian mentioned, and what you can do to support yourselves or others who may be grieving the loss of a loved one. So just a show of hands, I'll have to kind of look at the Zoom screen too, I guess. How many of you have grieved the death of a spouse or a family member you were close to or a good friend? A lot of people. You know, we know intellectually that death is unavoidable, but in this culture we tend to pretend that it is. We're kind of future-oriented, we're doing-oriented. We don't want to just, it's hard for, in general, for Americans as a culture to just sit with hard feelings. What was interesting is the song Smile that we sang earlier. You know, smile and the world smiles with you. There's a line that wasn't in that song that we all have heard, you know, cry and you cry alone. And that's kind of a cultural thing. So, you know, the thing is also, if we love someone, grief is unavoidable, as well as the death of all of us at some point. And then the more deeply we've loved, the more deeply we're going to grieve. So everyone grieves differently. There's no right way. Some people grieve by working hard. Some people can't stop crying. Some people might do both at different times of the day. There's just no right way. One way isn't better than another. And despite, you know, we've heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, which were really about dying, not so much about grieving, but they were kind of taken there. But the truth is, there's no stages in grief. It's messy. There's really just facets, and people experience all of it at different times, sometimes moment to moment. I mean, I could have been, I'll talk more about my own experience, but you know, when my wife died, there were times when just in minutes I would move from laughing and joking with someone to just at a complete loss and crying and feeling hopeless. So grief is transformative, and in the most basic way, because life will never be the same without the person that we lost. But it's often in deeper ways too. Grief can teach us empathy for others in pain when we've experienced pain ourselves. Death and grief can teach us what's most important in life. I read somewhere that grief carves out our heart and makes more room for love. So, as Brian mentioned, my first wife died in 1991. She had a congenital heart problem. I knew about it the day I met her. We were married 7.5 years, and one day quite suddenly, she started having some heart problems, and that night she died, or the next morning she died. And yeah, it was devastating, of course. And it took me quite some time, actually. I met Yvonne a few months after Susan. My first wife's name was Susan. I met her a few months after Susan died, but we were friends. And there was a point, actually, about a year after we met, when she laughs about our proposal, my proposal to her, because I said, I'm not ready to get married yet, but when I am, I'd like it to be you. And she said, is that a proposal? Do you want to think about it? But that was just the truth. It's like I knew that I wasn't ready to be in a new, serious, committed relationship. But I knew that she was the right one for me when it was time. And I was very fortunate that she was able to respect that. So a couple of things that I did to take care of myself was I attended a weekly support group. I saw a therapist for a while, and I wrote a lot of poetry. I'd been writing, anytime I felt terrible, I wrote since I'd been in my teens, and so that kind of came naturally to me. And it was very helpful to get feelings that were stuck inside of me outside where I could look at them. And I'm going to talk more about that later. So there's a nationally known grief expert named David Kessler. He wrote a book recently called The Sixth Stage of Grief, Finding Meaning. He talks about an Aboriginal tradition in Northern Australia where the night after a death, everyone in the village puts a piece of furniture outside the door. Or if they have things outside, they'll rearrange it all. And when the grieving family comes out the next morning, they see that everything has changed. And so it's a way that the community can let people know, we understand that life will never be the same for you or for us, because they cared about the person too. Judaism has community rituals, sitting Shiva and some other things. The Irish tradition of holding a wake, although there's a lot of jokes about it and you just see people getting drunk in the movies, the truth is it's a way of bringing people together to honor not just the one who died, but the ones who are left behind. And that community is really critical in grieving, because grief can be very isolating. When we're grieving, this was my experience, we don't believe that anyone else who hasn't been through it could possibly understand what we're feeling. The day-to-day life of the world that has been left behind, in a way it feels like we've left the day-to-day of the world behind too, because we're now in uncharted territory. And we just wonder, we look around at people just kind of going about their day and being busy, and we wonder, how can they not see what's happened? My wife is gone. Don't they know they could lose everything? Don't they understand what's important? And it's a very common experience. So we're already feeling isolated, and then you add to that isolation, the physical isolation that COVID, especially last year, brought to people. There were over 600,000 deaths from COVID so far in the US, over 4 million worldwide. I read an estimate that for every death, 9 people are left behind grieving that person. So that's millions of people who are grieving on top of the ones who would have been anyway had COVID not been there. So I would say we have a pandemic of grief on top of the viral pandemic. And so it's a huge problem everywhere. Does anyone here know anyone who's died from COVID, or know the families of people who've been left behind? Yeah, a number of you. So last year especially, it was almost impossible to get together. And so that need to be in community to grieve was it was a real challenge, and people struggled with it. We all saw images of people kind of stuck behind glass trying to get to their loved one. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to get back to it, but I wanted to read a poem about that's in this book. It's called Pandemic Funeral. It kind of illustrates that. It's by a woman named Kirsten Porter. There is no body, no casket, no roses, just a computer screen of faces to say goodbye to you. My cousin, the lanky boy of my childhood, just a year older, a foot taller, bruised at the knee, quiet but kind, always kind. How do we send you off? Without a church, without hand-holding, without leftover soups and casseroles, the rituals of our grief achingly unobserved. We tell our stories, your stories, the sounds of our voices reaching through the screens, the way we touch each other when we remember you. So, as I said, I wrote poetry when I was grieving. And eventually I started looking for published poetry by other people, because I wanted to just feel it in others' work, and in a way it was a way for me to have community. And I put out a call for submissions. Those poems and stories, I received stories often along with the poems. People told me about the person who had died. They told me things like, my therapist thought it might be helpful for me to send this to you. You're the first person I've ever shared this poem with. And that intimacy kind of formed the basis of this book. Humans are storytellers. And poetry is a particular way of telling a story that gets to the heart of experience without having to explain how we got there. So I'm going to read a short poem of mine that was about my experience. The ocean waves pile up on one another, rolling forward relentlessly, smashing onto the beach, and eyes wide open, powerful in rage. I scream with all my might, but the surf drowns my voice. I cannot bring her back. So I didn't know when I was grieving that there's actually a whole field of counseling developed called poetry therapy to help people through pain and trauma. And I have a quote here from a book called Poetic Medicine by a man named John Fox, who wrote the forward to my book, but he's also got a nonprofit called the Institute for Poetic Medicine. And he wrote a book called Poetic Medicine. Poetry is a natural medicine, a tincture derived from the stuff of life itself, your experience. Poems speak to us when nothing else will. Poetry helps us to feel our lives rather than just be numb. The page, touched with our poem, becomes a place for painful feelings to be held, explored, and transformed. So what is it about poetry that's so helpful as opposed to journaling or other kinds of writing? I think it's because anyone can write poetry, regardless of their education or their writing skill. In poetry, we don't have to explain ourselves or justify ourselves, or even write in complete sentences. It doesn't have to use beautiful language. We write for ourselves and no one else, and we can just focus on the essence of what matters to us. See, here's a very simple poem. It's basically a haiku. Actually, I don't have it marked, but I know it. Richard is dead. The word sits on the page like the obscenity it is. And it just says so much in so few words. So poems like this are mirrors for both the reader and the writer. As John said, for a writer, it helps us to see our experience on the page, even if no one else reads it. And as a reader who may not have been able to find the words for our own feelings, it's validating, sometimes even a revelation, to find ourselves in someone else's words. We know that others know how we feel when we read a poem that reflects our own experience, and it helps to break the isolation that I was talking about. So, where are we on time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
5 more minutes.
Okay. So I hope I've given you a sense of what grief might be like if you haven't experienced it yourself, although many of you have. I'd like to talk for a minute about how we can help other people who might be grieving. So I'll start with a few don'ts. Don't give platitudes. You know, things like, they're in heaven now, or they're out of pain, or at least they lived a full life, or you'll always carry them in their heart, in your heart. I mean, they may say that, and that's fine, but when we say that to someone, it's well intended, but often it's to make us feel better. Not really, it doesn't really make them feel better. What they want is just to have their pain witnessed. They just want to know that you know how they're feeling. And another thing is to try not to give advice, like you should try prayer, exercise, meditation, you know, whatever it is that, even if you have grieved yourself, it may have worked for you, it may not work for them. And again, it's kind of, it's better to point them to resources that will be helpful and let them kind of find things for themselves that are out there. So some of the do's, if you don't know what to say, just the one thing not to say is, I'm sorry for your loss. It's kind of a personal peeve of mine, but it's so generic. And it's extremely common. It would be better to just be honest, and if you don't know what to say, and say, I don't know what to say. You could say, I can't imagine what you're going through. It must be so hard for you. If you have experienced a similar loss, then tell them about it. Because again, the isolation is so hard. And so if you can share your own experience, not so much what you did that worked or, it's better now, but just, I know how it is for you. I've been there. So you could offer to help with tasks, because daily life can be really hard initially for some people. And so you could offer to take their child to school, or offer to shop for groceries, or make some phone calls for them. I know one thing I had help with was there were a lot of people to call to say Susan died. And I had a friend who made some of those calls for me, and it just made it so much easier. Offer to listen if you can sit with their pain and not feel that you have to fix it. So just resist that urge. Offer to come over for a cup of tea. You can suggest a specific resource like Hospice of SLO has some really good resources. Nicole, I'm sure, can tell you about a lot more. And give them a good book on grief. Look at the reviews on Amazon. But try to avoid faith-based books unless you know that faith is something that's really important to them, because that can be off-putting otherwise. So taking care of yourself, the two most important things are avoid isolating yourself, which doesn't mean that you don't want to have a lot of time alone, but just find a way to stay connected to people who can support you. And also be patient with yourself. It's different for everyone.
Mark has a couple of copies of his book here. If you're interested in purchasing it, that would be fine. He'll give you an autographed copy if you like. So,
Yeah, I'll just be here afterward if you want. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We lost 3 members of our club during COVID last year, and we had, at least in my view, speaking especially for Frank Martinez, who I used to drive here every day. I don't think I've ever gotten through the process yet of grieving, because they couldn't have a funeral back then. So this is very dear to me.